When events of the Second World War unfolded across Europe, it seemed that the sky had become the primary battlefield. By late summer 1940, aerial strikes had turned into a central strategic tool, reshaping the nature of warfare. During this period, British military analysts recorded a rapid intensification of the German air campaign, aimed at destroying industrial infrastructure, transportation hubs, and, most critically, civilian districts. It was a phase that would later be recognized as one of the most intense periods of aerial conflict, a campaign designed to break the morale of the British population and inflict irreparable damage on cities and the national economy. Despite the efforts of the British Air Forces, the strain of these attacks grew so severe by autumn that the air defense system operated at its absolute limits. Amid daily damage reports, pressure mounted for unconventional approaches that extended beyond standard tactical frameworks. These conditions gave rise to individuals whose names often became lost within the vast mass of wartime chronicles, even though their actions carried consequences far greater than their rank or official standing suggested. Staff documents from that time mention instances in which single pilots, operating outside typical combat scenarios, altered the outcome of specific operations. Such episodes rarely appeared in public reports, as they did not align with the broader narrative of large-scale air campaigns. Yet in practice, these actions sometimes introduced critical disruptions, breaking sequences of events that might have led to far more catastrophic results. Night after night, London and other major cities faced a continuous threat of destruction. Historians later noted the profound psychological pressure of that period, a factor not easily measured, yet clearly reflected in civilian behavior. Under constant danger, the public depended on demonstrations of resilience, even when those demonstrations remained hidden behind official language and formal summaries. It was within this context that the path of a particular pilot, later referred to as nearly forgotten, took shape. His role in countering the air offensive remained understated for decades, despite the significance of his actions. Archival materials reveal that among the many defenders of the British skies were pilots performing missions in conditions where the outcome rested entirely on a single decision. These were moments when any mistake could lead to disaster, while any precise action could create an unexpected shift in the larger picture. For researchers studying that era, such episodes represent personal responsibility expressed within the rigid machinery of war. Within the extensive reports of the air campaign, brief mentions can be found of a pilot who would eventually become associated with one critical operation. His assignments did not stand out in official summaries, yet their collective impact proved substantial. His story begins long before the true importance of his work was recognized, unfolding in a period when every movement in the sky might form part of a turning point in the war. When researchers examine the British aviation archives in an attempt to reconstruct the trajectories of individual pilots from the years of the air campaign, many names appear only as fragments scattered among reports, flight tables, and technical summaries. Yet one of these names became a connecting thread in a chain of events that would later influence the scale of destruction inflicted on British cities during the height of the aerial threat. This pilot was not among those widely mentioned in newspapers, nor was he awarded high decorations. His path was gradual and almost invisible, but it was individuals like him who shaped the resilience of the defense during operations where entire outcomes could hinge on a single aircraft. According to service records, he joined the Air Force before the outbreak of full-scale hostilities, at a time when Europe still held on to an illusion of stability. Training was conducted at an accelerated pace, reflecting the nation's urgency to prepare as many pilots as possible amid rising international tension. His performance did not stand out among the other cadets. Most reports described him using standard evaluations, careful, disciplined, able to follow instructions without deviation. He did not display extraordinary maneuvering talent or exceptional scores. However, his file gradually revealed a quality that would prove decisive in aerial warfare: consistent precision. This precision became especially visible by 1940, when the British Air Force adopted a stricter schedule of night duties and emergency sorties. Endurance quickly emerged as a key requirement, especially during night flights where visibility was minimal and a single error could lead to catastrophe. His sorties were marked by the fact that he consistently returned with his aircraft intact, even in adverse weather or along routes with significant risk. These reliable results began to draw quiet notice. As the pressure grew in all segments of the air defense structure, pilots were regularly forced to compensate for shortages in equipment and personnel. In such an environment, those who maintained composure and followed procedures with unwavering precision became crucial. He was one of the individuals who carried out flights that seemed routine from the outside but were essential to keeping the defense system operational. Documents from the period indicate that headquarters took note of his ability to function effectively in conditions of information deficit. This meant operating with incomplete data on weather, routes, or enemy activity while maintaining full situational control. Such traits seldom received public recognition, yet they formed the backbone of later missions that demanded exceptional reliability. By the time the major waves of nighttime attacks began threatening British cities, he had already become an experienced pilot capable of executing assignments with a high degree of autonomy. Command eventually assigned him to operations of increased complexity, particularly those involving the interception of single or small groups of enemy aircraft acting outside conventional attack waves. These missions required not only technical skill but the capacity to make independent decisions when support might be unavailable. Historians would later point out that this training and these experiences prepared him for an operation that would become his defining moment. He entered a period in which a single pilot could alter the course of an enemy mission, disrupting sequences that might otherwise lead to severe losses. At the time, however, no one, including himself, could foresee that one such operation would change the direction of the air campaign, becoming a nearly forgotten but pivotal episode waiting to be rediscovered. By the end of 1940, as enemy attacks intensified, the British air defense system began to experience more pronounced strain. The rapidly expanding scale of the conflict gradually left individual pilots with fewer choices, forcing them to adapt to an environment where unpredictability dictated every action. When nighttime raids became an almost routine part of civilian life, the work of aviation units transformed into a sequence of tasks demanding strict discipline. Under such conditions, the fate of any single pilot became inseparable from the broader situation, where even accumulated experience seemed perpetually insufficient. Analytical reports from headquarters noted the emergence of a new enemy tactic: small, dispersed groups of aircraft operating at irregular intervals. Their purpose was to overload tracking systems and reduce the effectiveness of interceptors. Instead of large waves that could be identified and countered, threats appeared as fragmented, unpredictable signals. For fighter pilots, this meant that each sortie required intense concentration despite minimal reconnaissance data. These circumstances increased the demand for those capable of acting autonomously without relying on a clear operational pattern. During this period, he was assigned with increasing frequency to intercept missions tied to such dispersed threats. Headquarters recognized his ability to reach the designated search zone on time and maintain the required course, even in low visibility and without stable radio guidance. This compensated for gaps in the radar network and gradually strengthened the command's trust in him. Night after night, as industrial districts, docks, railway junctions, and residential quarters suffered damage, pilots like him provided at least some measure of control over the airspace. In this environment, even a single successful interception could prevent catastrophic losses, whereas one failure could trigger a chain of destruction whose effects would be felt for months. Archival data confirms that near the end of the raid season, he was transferred to a unit tasked with rapid response to emerging threats. This decision reflected a growing recognition of his ability to operate effectively with incomplete information. Within the professional sphere, such an assignment represented a significant increase in responsibility, even if it was not accompanied by official distinction. He entered a phase of service in which each subsequent sortie was part of a broader strategic necessity. The war left no alternatives. It required constant presence in the air and the readiness to act under any conditions. As losses increased throughout the Air Force, experienced pilots became a diminishing yet invaluable resource. With each mission, he moved closer to an operation that would later be seen as one of the quietly transformative moments of the aerial campaign, a mission whose significance was recognized only in hindsight. This chapter of his service marked the transition from routine night duty to the threshold of an event in which a single pilot would soon play a decisive role. Though unrecognized at the time, this period formed the foundation for the defining moment of his career. By the beginning of the winter period, the command of the British Air Forces observed a clear trend. Enemy raids conducted by small groups were becoming increasingly precise, while their routes grew harder to predict. This suggested that the enemy aimed not only to inflict destruction but also to systematically probe the weaknesses of the defensive network. In such conditions, every pilot capable of autonomous action and quick decision-making became a critical element of the system. It was during this time that a sequence of events unfolded, eventually leading to an operation long overshadowed by the larger battles of the war. Archival documents indicate that throughout autumn, headquarters began receiving reports of so-called exploratory flights missions carried out by single or paired enemy aircraft. Their purpose was to locate radar stations, identify patrol routes, and test how quickly British interceptors responded. These aircraft rarely carried large bomb loads. Their danger lay instead in preparing the ground for future coordinated attacks. If intercepted in time, the enemy would lose the ability to update their tactical plans. If not, subsequent raids could be conducted with deadly accuracy. It was during this period that he was increasingly assigned to flights aimed at detecting and intercepting such reconnaissance attempts. His consistency, ability to operate without reliable visual references, and resilience under minimal guidance made him an ideal candidate for missions that required individual responsibility. Staff notes emphasized that his presence improved the overall effectiveness of night interception efforts. On 12 December 1940, a signal arrived indicating a possible enemy reconnaissance flight along the eastern coastline. Usual verification procedures yielded no conclusive results. Yet given the high enemy activity, Command ordered several aircraft into the air to investigate. He was among those selected. Records show that the operation began under unstable weather conditions. Shifting cloud layers and turbulent air currents made navigation challenging. Such missions required flying at high altitudes where visual contact was nearly impossible and the available equipment struggled to detect faint signals. Pilots had to rely on minute environmental cues, wind direction, engine sound, distant flickers from searchlights, anything that could help orient in near-blind conditions. Despite these challenges, he maintained a stable course and gradually advanced toward the suspected area. Minutes after entering the designated corridor, he received confirmation of an unidentified aerial object. Although the data were limited, he initiated a maneuver designed to place him at the optimal angle for interception. Reports note that the weather worsened significantly. The upper clouds thickened and strong. Gusts disturbed aircraft stability. Nevertheless, he continued without deviation. By the midpoint of the mission, analysts recognized that the detected aircraft was likely conducting reconnaissance intended to refine the enemy's targeting of strategic sites. Its path intersected with several vital defense lines. A successful reconnaissance run would have provided valuable data for a large-scale attack. A timely interception, however, could disrupt that sequence entirely. Despite the poor visibility, he managed to enter a zone where brief cloud breaks occasionally revealed silhouettes. According to reports, ground-based radar support at this stage was minimal, forcing him to rely almost entirely on his training and judgment. This moment would later be viewed as the first decisive step toward a more significant contribution. That night marked a turning point. Although he could not have known it then, the operation placed him on the path to an event that would later be regarded as one of the quiet yet consequential interventions of the air war, a moment when a single pilot could alter the unfolding of an entire operation. After the December sorties, when headquarters began analyzing the results of enemy reconnaissance maneuvers, it became evident that the tension in the airspace would continue to grow. The increasing number of solitary reconnaissance aircraft operating in low-visibility conditions suggested that the enemy was preparing for another major wave of strikes. These indicators were usually noted in documents as understated technical observations, but experienced analysts understood that they marked a tactical shift toward more precise and potentially devastating attacks on key infrastructure. In these weeks, a new duty rotation was introduced, requiring pilots capable of reacting rapidly to fragmented radar signals. He was included in this group. Reports stated that he could operate effectively on distant approaches to likely raid corridors, where radar coverage was weaker and conditions changed minute by minute. Such missions demanded a combination of experience, endurance, and composure, especially as prolonged night flights offered little reassurance or support. On 15 December 1940 at 23, a new signal reached headquarters, a possible reconnaissance aircraft approaching the southeastern coastline. The information was inconsistent and incomplete. The enemy's flight path could traverse several possible routes, and none of the observation posts could confirm the data. However, based on patterns observed in the previous days, analysts suspected that this was another attempt by the enemy to adjust their targeting system for future strikes. That evening, he was launched earlier than the others, a decision reflecting the command's trust in his ability to function under informational uncertainty. Weather conditions were unstable, humid air, intensified cloud reflections, producing false visual cues, and smoke lingering over ground targets interfered with observation posts. In such an environment, the pilot effectively became the only reliable instrument of detection. Upon reaching the designated area, he began a systematic search pattern designed to cover the maximum possible airspace. These maneuvers required significant concentration and careful fuel management. His dossier repeatedly emphasized one key trait: the ability to maintain the balance between active searching and conserving vital resources. According to the reports, a faint radar signal appeared shortly after the search began, indicating a possible high-altitude object. Such signals could easily be atmospheric interference, yet given the operational context, he could not afford to dismiss it. Drawing on his experience, he steered toward the sector where the trace had appeared. As he ascended through the cloud layers, he entered a zone where rare breaks appeared. It was through one of these narrow gaps that he reportedly sighted the silhouette of a long-range reconnaissance aircraft. Its route aligned directly with corridors leading toward key industrial and logistical facilities. Had the enemy completed its mission, the data collected could have prepared the ground for a devastating attack. Identifying the target was only the first challenge. The greater difficulty lay in maintaining contact through dense cloud cover and turbulent winds. Aircraft of that era had limited high-altitude capability, and icing conditions posed a serious threat. Despite this, he maneuvered precisely, keeping the enemy aircraft within potential interception range. Reports note that he managed to maintain visual awareness of the reconnaissance aircraft for longer than was typical during such missions. This extended contact window created the opportunity to disrupt its operation. Even if the enemy attempted evasive action or altitude shifts, he kept track by reading subtle aerodynamic cues and momentary glimpses in the drifting clouds. Later analysis concluded that this prolonged interference delayed or prevented the transfer of crucial reconnaissance data. Enemy reconnaissance flights typically relayed their findings within minutes of completing their route. But that night, the timeline was disrupted to such an extent that the subsequent coordinated attack had to be abandoned. This episode became one of the clearest demonstrations of how a single pilot could alter the strategic environment. By interrupting the reconnaissance process, he forced the enemy to rework its plan, undermining an operation that might have resulted in widespread destruction. Although the official reports described the event in measured, understated terms, its effects were unmistakable in the shifting pattern of raids that followed. This night brought him closer to the moment when his actions would shape the broader course of the air war, an impact that would remain nearly invisible for decades. After the December interceptions, headquarters began noting gradual but unmistakable changes in the character of enemy activity in British airspace. German aviation, having encountered disruptions in its reconnaissance efforts, sought new methods of penetrating British defenses undetected. These adaptations did not appear dramatically at first. Instead, they manifested through subtle indicators: slight shifts in flight routes, unusual timing between reconnaissance attempts, and increased activity during weather conditions previously considered unsuitable for operations. All of these fragments pointed toward the enemy's expanding tactical flexibility. Although the British defensive system had grown stronger, it remained vulnerable to these evolving methods. Radar stations of that era were not always able to track small targets within heavy cloud cover or atmospheric instability. The increasing strain on pilots further amplified the challenge. Many began to experience psychological fatigue as the repeated night missions eroded their reserves of focus and endurance. His service reports during these weeks reflected exactly such a period: frequent sorties, shortened rest cycles, and a steadily rising burden of responsibility. Nevertheless, his performance remained consistent. Command reports emphasized that he retained full capacity for autonomous action, even when operating with minimal information. Such traits were becoming rare as continuous night operations pushed many pilots to their limits. This reliability partly explained why he was increasingly assigned to missions involving high uncertainty and elevated risk. The final days of December were especially tense. The enemy attempted to exploit periods of poor weather to bypass observation posts, and the British command expected the reappearance of fresh reconnaissance missions at any moment. During one such night, radar stations registered a series of faint signals in the northern approaches. These traces did not match natural atmospheric patterns and might have represented false readings, but experienced analysts judged them a likely sign of another stealth reconnaissance attempt. He was once again selected for the sortie. Though fatigue had accumulated, he demonstrated the same ability to interpret ambiguous data and act with deliberate precision. Weather conditions that night were particularly difficult. A blend of dense cloud, night humidity, and shifting winds made navigation extremely challenging. Despite this, he reached the designated area and began executing the structured search pattern required for wide-area scanning. During this phase of his service, he developed a skill that would later become decisive: the ability to detect minor deviations in visual and environmental signals and interpret them within the broader context of atmospheric flow. This heightened sensitivity allowed him to identify potential threats invisible to less experienced pilots. Service documents later noted that his perceptiveness prevented several attempted reconnaissance penetrations during this period. By the end of the month, the enemy's intentions became clearer. Patterns in intercepted signals suggested preparations for a new wave of attacks. Accurate reconnaissance data would have given the enemy a significant advantage in planning these operations. This made his role increasingly crucial. He was part of a narrow protective layer that could disrupt the enemy's preparations before they materialized into full-scale strikes. All these events were leading in one direction toward the key operation that would define his wartime contribution: At the time, however, this remained only an unspoken tension embedded within the sequence of night flights that grew more demanding with each passing mission. What followed would reveal just how significant a single pilot's actions could become in the vast framework of the air war. By early January, the situation in Britain's airspace had taken on what analysts described as a threshold condition of threat. This meant that the enemy was preparing for a new series of raids, though their exact structure and direction remained unknown. Reconnaissance aircraft, previously appearing sporadically, now emerged more frequently, yet continued to operate with the same level of secrecy. These signs suggested preparations for an operation that could become one of the most destructive of the winter. At this moment, he was tasked with a mission that would later be viewed as critical to the defense of several industrial regions. On 5 January 1941 at 2240, radar stations registered faint traces at the altitude typically used for reconnaissance routes. The signal was unstable, periodically fading, but experienced operators recognized characteristics of a well-equipped reconnaissance aircraft employing radio interference methods. Command decided to launch several interceptors, including him, since such missions required pilots who could operate without steady ground support. There was a strong possibility that the aircraft was attempting to cross a corridor leading to industrial facilities near the coastline. His takeoff that night occurred in conditions of strong wind and high moisture, both of which made gaining altitude difficult and reduced aircraft maneuverability. Despite this, he reached the designated zone and began searching based solely on fragmented information provided during briefing. Reports note that he acted with strict precision, systematically covering potential enemy routes. Under these conditions, even a minor navigational error could allow the reconnaissance aircraft to disappear into cloud cover, making interception impossible. 20 minutes into the patrol, a new, weak signal appeared. It was so unstable that it could easily have been dismissed as atmospheric interference. Still, drawing from his experience in previous missions, he turned toward the likely location. This decision reflected his ability to detect patterns and anomalies invisible to less seasoned pilots. Upon entering a break in the cloud layer, he reached an area where occasional gaps allowed rare lines of sight. According to later reconstruction, it was through one such brief opening that he identified the silhouette of a long-range reconnaissance aircraft. Its trajectory led directly toward corridors connected to major industrial and logistical facilities. If the enemy succeeded in gathering precise data, the resulting attack could have inflicted months of consequential damage. Identifying the aircraft was only one step. Maintaining contact in dense cloud and turbulent winds posed the far greater challenge. Interceptors of that era were not designed for stable operations in upper cloud layers, and icing posed a constant risk. Nevertheless, he maneuvered with careful precision, pacing the enemy aircraft while maintaining the safest possible distance for a potential interception. Reports indicate that the duration of this encounter exceeded typical engagement times under such conditions. He managed to hold visual awareness long enough to disrupt the reconnaissance route. Even as the enemy attempted altitude changes or course adjustments, he compensated by interpreting fleeting silhouettes, air currents, and engine resonance, a skill honed over months of night sorties. Subsequent analysis confirmed the strategic significance of this disruption. Reconnaissance aircraft typically transmitted collected data within minutes of completing their route. That night, however, the timeline was broken to such an extent that the enemy could not proceed with the planned strike. Forced to operate without accurate coordinates, they postponed the operation entirely. This event became a clear demonstration of the influence a single pilot could exert on the broader course of the war. By interrupting the reconnaissance process, he forced the enemy to reevaluate its strategy and prevented what could have been a devastating attack. Although official wartime records described the event with characteristic restraint, the effects became evident in the altered pattern of subsequent raids. This night defined the moment when his personal actions intersected directly with the larger trajectory of the air war. Yet, at the time, neither he nor the command realized how pivotal his intervention would prove. Only later, through careful historical analysis, would the full meaning of that mission become clear. After the January interception that proved decisive in preventing one of the most dangerous enemy reconnaissance operations, the overall intensity in British airspace began to diminish. The enemy gradually altered its routes, avoiding those corridors previously intended for the collection of precise targeting data. This shift delayed preparations for a new series of large-scale strikes, sparing several industrial cities that had been considered high-value targets. At first glance, these changes seemed like a natural tactical adjustment, but post-war analysis revealed that the disruption of the reconnaissance sequence was the primary cause. In the official service summaries, his name appeared only occasionally. He was credited with completing a difficult mission under complex conditions, but without emphasis or extended commentary. Such treatment was common during the war. Individual actions rarely stood out in the broader narrative of national defense. Yet his contribution, though understated, had long-lasting consequences. By depriving the enemy of updated reconnaissance data, he forced revisions to their planned routes and reduced the accuracy of subsequent operations. As winter drew to a close, his service continued in its usual pattern. He still conducted night patrols, monitored vulnerable sectors, and responded to emerging threats identified by radar operators. However, the significance of his January mission gradually faded into the background as new operational concerns took priority. This shift ensured that the key episode of his service remained largely unrecognized in official wartime documentation. Years later, when historians began analyzing the fragmented datasets of the air war, they encountered irregularities in early January raid patterns. This prompted a detailed investigation. After reconstructing the sequence of events, researchers identified the disrupted reconnaissance flight and traced it back to his interception. From there, they concluded that his mission had prevented the enemy from executing a large and precisely targeted attack. Even so, his name did not enter broader public memory. Wartime records tended to highlight large operations, whereas individual pilots' contributions were often framed merely as component parts of the larger mechanism. Thus, the pilot who halted a reconnaissance effort, and in doing so altered the direction of an entire aerial campaign, remained almost unknown outside academic circles. The reconstructed narrative, completed many decades later, underscores a recurring truth. Significant shifts in war often arise from the actions of individuals operating far from the visibility of grand strategy. His work lacked dramatic flair, but it possessed the precision, discipline, and clarity needed to avert long-term damage. A pilot whose legacy faded within the larger conflict nevertheless exemplified how responsibility and attention to detail can influence events far beyond the cockpit. He became an example of a phenomenon frequently encountered in the study of conflict. Wars are shaped not only by massive operations, but also by countless individual decisions, many of which remain hidden or forgotten. His story, restored through careful archival work, stands as a reminder of the importance of recognizing those quiet contributions, the ones that alter outcomes without ever becoming part of the official narrative.